Hello and welcome to VHTB, your guide to the talent, culture, and capital forces shaping the hard tech startup ecosystem. My name is Brian Major, COO and CTO of Ad Astra Talent Advisors. At Ad Astra, we work closely with founders building hard tech startups across space, climate, and defense. Our focus is helping those companies hire the executives and technical leaders who can turn bold ideas into functioning systems. And because talent decisions shape the trajectory of these companies, we also spend a lot of time helping founders think clearly about how those teams scale and how leadership evolves as the company grows. I'm joined by Matt Jurtson of Built. How you doing, Matt? Fantastic. And Justice Killian of Space Capital. Fantastic. Yeah, let's do it. So today we want to go back in time a little bit and do almost like a little bit of a post-mortem of CleanTech 1.0. So if you guys remember, there's massive enthusiasm for hardware and climate tech in like the late 2000s. And we saw a lot of venture money pour into energy and hardware companies. But then a lot of that money disappeared when timelines and costs turned out to be tougher than everyone was expecting. Timelines were stretched, returns were disappointing. And now it seems like we're seeing some capital rotate back into physical industries again. This is driven by AI, defense, climate, and other big policy shifts. So what do you guys think? Do investors actually understand how different working with hardware actually is? Or are they underestimating how long and expensive it takes to scale hardware companies? I loved it though. There's a lot of wisdom and context in that. Thank you. Matt, what are you seeing in this? Are you seeing teams that are built differently, that are approaching problems in a different way than maybe they would have been 15-ish years ago when the last hardware bubble burst? Or like, do you have reason to think that kind of on the people side of things will be different this time? Yeah, I like where we're going with this. If we are thinking back to the late 2000s and all the different companies that failed and lost money and went bankrupt, but there were some that succeeded. Obviously, we talk about SpaceX a lot, but it wasn't really in the clean energy space. It was kind of pioneering a little bit more of a new market in a lot of ways. But Tesla, right? Like, was very much in this clean energy space, and it came out the other side and is successful and is one of the top like market cap companies on the planet. And they almost went bankrupt like what, several times during that period. So I think that maybe what you guys are speaking to right now is, okay, Tesla is a little more of an exception than the rule, but what can we learn from how Tesla got through that valley and how they were able to actually deliver hardware, meet customer needs, despite being in a really, really tough market where almost everyone else failed. So I think maybe it's interesting to look a little bit more at Tesla and see what can we learn from them, and why do we, and are companies today emulating some of what Tesla was doing at the time to help get us a better place this time around with investor excitement riding high again. Yeah, that's pretty fascinating. I think we are seeing companies raise like bigger rounds earlier now too, and focusing on like, hey, we aren't just a company developing some tech, like we are arguably what the tech is, building something at a very large scale. Like, how much money has K2 raised, for example? And not that they're not doing incredible things, but they're raising disproportionately large amounts of capital compared to like the hardware that they've actually flown. Is this them attempting to jump over the valley of death by saying like, yeah, it's really hard to establish the market fit before the valley. We're going to get investors on aligned with us that, hey, this is how we're going to get across it, is by with a good plan and lots of capital, and let's just go build the thing quicker. Yeah, fantastic. Matt, anything to add? Otherwise, I think is a good spot for us to close out here. Yeah, for sure. It sounds like we're kind of in alignment here that, we've seen these types of bubbles come up and burst again and again over time, even like referencing back to 1900s and the railroad industry. But some things that are maybe different now is that we have a lot more investors who are really specialized in investing in hardware companies and seeing through the entire progression from pre-seed all the way to IPO. There's like specialized capital for growth for hardware companies. And then another big thing is having seen that there's this new approach to iterating on hardware and building successful companies with this new approach. SpaceX, Tesla, Tesla specifically survived this clean tech 1.0 bubble, and I think we're learning a lot of things about how you can develop hardware with speed and pace and iteration and challenging requirements. And also, there's some good things to learn about from how Tesla got through that, and rely, like, how can you use the government as a key cornerstone customer when you're still kind of building up your product market fit with the broader market. So some cool lessons learned here, some reasons to be optimistic, and also some reasons to look out for a correction here before too long. So thanks both for joining me in this conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I think that there is an expectation that the infrastructure, it's sort of hard to anticipate the amount of demand and what will be used in a time frame. And so you get, a tremendous amount of excitement, everybody racing to sort of own the rails, so to speak, and infrastructure gets overbuilt. And then there's, sort of a realization that, now we have way too much, capacity and not enough demand because it takes a lot longer for things to build up around that infrastructure for utilization to materialize. That was true with the railroads. That was true with the interstate. That was true with the internet. It has historically been true with space in some of the previous sort of eras. And so, that I think will, it is sort of the case. I think with the excitement around defense tech and some of the hard tech that's being invested in today, there's sort of an over excitement and sort of an under a lack of understanding about where demand comes. But over time, like those technology trends are secular. They do, like, the infrastructure is still highly valuable and ultimately gets utilized at a very high level. It just ends up taking a lot longer to sort of realize that than a lot of investors play out. And so I guess my hot take in this sort of cycle is that we do, relative to that sort of climate tech 1.0, is that we do have a different breed of investors than I think we did then. At that time, you had a lot of, software type investors that, really had no experience in hardware and deep tech and infrastructure build. And I think that we when the valley of death sort of showed up and it was too long to sort of cross that revenue chasm, it was really challenging. That whole episode in particular with the clean tech was heavily subsidized by tax credits, and the unit economics just didn't make sense for the scale that we were operating at. I do think there's like three things probably that are fundamentally different. There's a variety of different investors now that are from seed to sort of IPO, full stack investors that specialize in hardware. And they've evolved and they've cut their teeth and they live, some of them survive through this clean tech 1.0. So they do have balance sheets to help bridge, that sort of valley of death. You do have like specialized growth capital that lives in like climate or defense that, is looking for and trying to help connect, the gaps between where the hardware is at and where the customers and where the market is at, and trying to systematically bridge that. And I think that that's really important. And then I do think we have a new approach to hardware build that is more iterative, software defined, that allows us to approach the problems in a much more dynamic way. And I attribute a lot of that to SpaceX and the approach that they've taken. But and the talent base that they've trained up on that method. But they're not the only ones. I mean, the iPhone is a great example of that, and how you sort of can dynamically redefine your hardware constraints and swap out vendors and push over the air upgrades. And so that just approach to building hardware is permeating multiple industries now, and there's a lot of lift from that. So I think it is a fundamentally different time. Now I do think a lot of these things could be overbuilt. I'll pause there. That was a lot. I could throw out a few ideas. So if we sort of take out the Musk factor, which he just has this almost an unlimited ability to raise capital, and we just try to look at what the company did and some of the other forces that were really critical. And this was true of SpaceX too. They were incredible. Like, so Tesla was incredibly savvy at using those tax credits and bundling that into the purchase and making it easy for customers to be able to take advantage of that. And that was a huge subsidy, for the company. Arguably, like one of the biggest drivers of revenue for the company was the U.S. government and the tax subsidies that they were getting. And you could actually say the same thing for SpaceX, with NASA being such a huge customer and all the IP transfer and anchoring a lot of their early works with COTS and ultimately Crew and really sort of anchoring the business. And so I think there's a lesson there that, when you're doing some of this really deep tech work, you have to work within the frameworks and understand where the money is. And then I think that leads to the second point is like, you got to go big. You can't sort of half-heartedly approach this. You have to amass a tremendous amount of capital, really, then scale up your operations. And Musk has always done that with, the gigafactories and now Terafab. Like everything is always bigger and economies of scale. And that is the fundamental truth within manufacturing is, your growth profile is constrained by, your manufacturing throughput. And so, scale is a product of how quickly you can sort of build and drive those unit economics down. And so I think that there's an important lesson there. And if you don't understand that and you don't, build for that rapid scale, you're just going to be left behind by others that do. Um, yeah, I think those are pretty good. Well, I do think that with some of these hardware companies, it's a little bit easier to engineer, like financially engineer an outcome where a lot of capital allows you to buy some really great talent and address this sort of manufacturer, the throughput question. And just by getting to a sufficient scale, you could compete with a lot of the big existing providers and carve out market share and also block new startups from coming in because a lot of the stuff is capital intensive. And so I do think, founders and investors that are quickly able to attract the majority of the capital, it just crowds out, other other new companies from coming in and trying to tackle them. And so if you have 10 of the 15 biggest, multi-stage firms on your, cap table, who else is going to fund an alternative to go head to head with you? So it just inherently sort of like creates a monopoly engineered on the cap table level. I think we're seeing that play out in a handful of industries.
There was one quick thing I wanted to add, Justice, just because it was funny when I saw this question come up. I had just seen a video come across my feed. It was this guy talking about how if you look back in history, there's been like episode after episode of infrastructure investments that end up in basically financial collapse. And so just like I looked it up on Claude, and just to give some sense of it, back in the 1840s, in the UK, there was an investment in railway. It got to the point where they were investing up to 7% of their GDP in railroad, and then the bubble burst, and all of basically the market got wiped out by about 50%. In the U.S. in the 1870s, a similar thing happened where it turned out in 1873, when there was a bunch of bank runs after one of the banks that was funding a lot of this stuff went bankrupt. 121 railroads got bankrupted, and that then led to 18,000 other businesses going bankrupt. There's, of course, in our lifetimes, the big buildup of internet and telecommunications and kind of the dot-com bubble and the telecom bubble that crashed in the early 2000s. So it is definitely, it is a thing that happens again and again. I mean, I wasn't doing what I do now back then, so I can't necessarily speak to it, but I do think I think the thing that I see the most that Justice brought up that I would definitely agree with is that change in how things are done. Like clearly there's been a dramatic revolution in how people think about development of hardware than there was in the past. That constant desire to think about the requirements, question all the requirements, really driving speed and pace. So I think the talent base, the culture that they're going to create and that is being created in these organizations. Even though I wasn't there before, I have to believe it's considerably different. And I think even, this kind of goes into the earlier conversation that we had about what's leading to these kinds of changes. And, I think before we were talking a little bit more specifically about, we were talking about hard tech in general, that there are all these different forces kind of coming together to make it more enduring. And it's not just, we believe that this is the right thing to do, and so we're going to give subsidies towards it. Like there's a lot more behind it than that. Yeah, I think we can close that. I think it's understandable why there's similarities, but there's also a lot of key differences in what's going on, and so there's definitely reason to be hopeful.